Ever wondered how trailblazing risk leaders navigate uncertainty with finesse and confidence? Uncover the surprising connections between their personal journey and professional prowess, and get ready to learn and elevate your risk management game with the RiskMasters podcast. Join host Julien Haye in collaboration with Risk.net as they delve into hidden gems of risk leadership through engaging conversations and thought-provoking insights from board directors to chief risk officers and business leaders.
Conduct beats control every day. Fix the culture and the controls will follow. When it comes to risk management, the frameworks we build are only as strong as the culture we create. Today's guest, Toby Billington, has spent decades transforming risk and compliance functions at some of the largest financial institutions, from his early career as a lawyer to shaping conduct frameworks at Barclays and leading first-line risk functions at Deutsche Bank and HSBC. Toby has seen firsthand what works and what doesn't when it comes to creating resilient organizations. In this episode, we'll explore how behavioral science can reshape compliance, tackle emerging threats like AI-driven fraud and quantum computing, and why simplifying frameworks may be the key to sustainable risk management. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to like, follow, and leave a review on your player of choice. Your feedback helps us bring more insights from industry leaders. For more resources, show notes, and articles, please visit my website, avtop.com. I am Julien Haye, and this is RiskMasters. It's my pleasure to welcome Toby Billington today.
Thank you, Julien.
Toby, actually, for background, used to be a lawyer, and I think we'll come back to that, and then transition into banking, conduct, risk culture, and the control space, and we are going to focus our discussion on that today. So, Toby, again, welcome with us today.
Thanks very much.
I'd like to come back to your career because you had a bit of a change in direction at some point. So, could you just walk us through a pivotal moment in your career and why did that happen and what did you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a lawyer for most of my career up until a point in time where I was working at Barclays and they had a conduct program. They were probably the first UK bank to launch a conduct program. So it was just after the LIBOR crisis had happened and we had inherited Hector Sanz from the FSA as was. And he was launching this conduct framework for Barclays, which wasn't going very well in the retail bank. And I, at that time, was the head of legal for the Barclays business. And I was asked by an ExCo member if I would mind dropping the legal and taking on conduct, which I did. And from there, my career ever since then has been very focused around conduct and controls, because obviously with Barclays being the first of the UK banks to really embrace that conduct framework and conduct training, I was suddenly somebody everybody wanted to hire because I knew about conduct frameworks for big banks.
And that's how we met several years later at Deutsche Bank, isn't it?
Indeed.
And in fact, you were asking me a question just before this interview, so I'm going to return the favor. If you had to change one thing in your career, what would it be?
Oh, wow. It's quite interesting. Yeah, so half of me thinks, gosh, I wish I'd stayed being a lawyer and not gone down this conduct and control route. The other half of me, though, I've really, really enjoyed the conduct work especially, and especially the focus that I've had using behavioural science as a driver of the discussion around what good conduct looks like in our industry. So that's probably why I would stay with the conduct side of my career rather than the legal side. I think the interesting one for us as an industry is I'm not sure that we've succeeded that well in terms of actually transforming the conduct and culture within our industry. I think that's a challenge that's still very relevant today, and it's one that we certainly are seeing more and more regulators globally taking more and more focus on, because I think there's a general understanding that there's still a lot of work to do, which is kind of disappointing after, we're kind of 15 years of having done this now.
Yeah, and we spend a lot of time, and I think organization has spent a lot of money as well trying to get it right, and still not quite. And we were talking about leadership before starting this interview. What leadership qualities do you think are most important to make sure we actually can get that right?
So going back to what we were talking about beforehand, authentic leadership is really vital. And I think the big challenge that we have is that we too often see the tone from the top being parroted by people who don't come across as being authentic and don't come across as genuinely believing what they're saying. And I think that's very, very visible. It's very easy to see when somebody is not being authentic. And I think trying to get people to understand why this matters is really vital, because once people understand why it matters, they start to care more about it. And then that actually makes a massive difference to the extent to which they sound compelling when they are delivering these messages to their teams.
And we had, I think, examples in our respective career where we saw people saying something and doing exactly the opposite the minute after. I will always remember, and I mean, that was a prevalent case in banking, right, with people cost-cutting, and next thing you know, the managing director driving that flies first to wherever they were flying to. That, for me, is the opposite of walking the talk, effectively.
There is absolutely a huge problem when you have senior leadership not walking the talk. And unfortunately, you do see that a lot still.
And you already started touching down on that, but some key lesson from your experience or what you've seen, what should leadership do to manage risk in that context and better? Any example that pops to mind beyond what we just talked about?
The real challenge, I think, with any kind of conversation around risk is making sure that the senior managers understand what they're talking about and that we focus on the behaviours and drivers of risk within our businesses. I think far too often you see risk conversations which are being led by lots and lots and lots of data and metrics, and you sit there and talk about numbers rather than talking about risks. And I think that's not a good way to engage with senior leadership in banking. People like to tell stories and like to hear stories. So if you start to make your risks have a story behind them, people will engage with them in a different way.
And it's about connecting a bit the so what, right? So what are we seeing and what does that mean from a business standpoint rather than having that very technical lingo you can find in the risk space from time to time? Communication is critical for that, isn't it?
It is. And also I think there's a danger, especially on markets businesses, that actually a lot of the senior leadership, if you give them data and numbers, they will dive down the rabbit hole of data and numbers because they tend to be data and number type people. So if you don't create a narrative about the actual risk, you can very quickly find that your risk conversation is actually completely ignoring the wider issue and is absolutely focused on that minute detail and not having a proper discussion about the thing that you really should be talking about.
And that's also the distinction between operational management of the business that can be data-driven, but a lot of the things in the conduct space are actually people-driven. In fact, it's solely people-driven, and it backs to the point around leadership as well. What do you think risk function or compliance actually should be doing to shift that from talking about data to talking about people and culture?
So first of all, I'll challenge whether or not the compliance function should be doing anything in that space at all. I'm a first-line practitioner these days. I came from a second-line background originally from legal and compliance, but I've now been in the first line for over 10 years. I think it's really vital that there's first-line ownership of these things. So we will come back to, I hope, a discussion about second-line roles and responsibilities. The ultimate driver has to be in the first line, and I think that's where you get those real conversations with that proper narrative. So the data and the facts need to be available for people who are driving those conversations. So you can't have these risk conversations in a vacuum. But equally, in my experience, if you spend your meetings discussing the data rather than discussing the risk, you're completely missing the point. Because back to our old conversation, which is conduct beats controls every day. If you get the right conduct and culture going really well within your first line, you will have far less control issues.
And you've opened the door to it. So what do you think the role of the second line is in that context?
This is a pet hate of mine. So when I was running compliance functions, I always made it really clear to my teams our job was to help find the problems and then to help fix them. That doesn't seem to be the role that compliance wants to have these days. My recent experience of dealing with the second line compliance functions, and indeed operational risk functions to some extent, is that they have taken their check and challenge role too far. All they do is hurl bricks from the sidelines at the first line. There's a very clear message, which is you in the first line own all the risk. It's your problem. You need to fix it. That's not the right way to go about this. So I had a fantastic experience when I was at HSBC. I was really lucky to have a really brilliant compliance advisory team who was supporting the global banking business. And they worked really closely with me to try and fix things. And in fact, they even lent me their assessment team to fix a very specific problem globally that we had. That's what I call a good compliance function. That's what I wish every compliance function was doing. However, it's definitely not what's happening. And it's weirdly not the regulatory imperative either. There's an increasing narrative from the regulators about independence of the second line and that check and challenge. And there's no discussion about co-owning risks or co-owning the solutions. And I think that's a really massive failing at the moment in our industry. It's something that we really ought to be addressing, because we should all be pulling together to try and fix stuff. It shouldn't be a case of there's completely independent teams who feel they have no responsibility at all to try and help fix things.
It creates a bit of a silo structure, doesn't it, with compartmentalization of roles and responsibilities with nothing meeting in the middle. By the sound of it.
And also, for my money, it's a waste of resources as well. So we already have a strong third line in audit whose job it is to do nothing but check whether other people are doing their jobs properly. If the second line don't feel that they own some responsibility for fixing stuff rather than just doing the problem finding, my question really is, well, what are they doing that audit isn't doing already? So we've effectively got two lines of audit function these days, and that can't be right.
I work for an organization where even within compliance, you had multiple of those lines competing with each other. So building a little bit on the cultural aspect and ethic, what do you think organizations can do to embed ethical behavior and customer protections across what they do?
I think there's two different questions there, which I'm going to split out. So having worked in conduct in both a retail and a wholesale environment, they're very, very different. So if we take retail first of all, so that's what I did at Barclays. The interesting thing with misconduct in a retail banking environment is that misconduct tends to happen at a management level. What I mean by that is it's the strategy that is wrong, usually in a retail environment. So retail tends to have problems with culture and conduct when they sell stuff to people that they shouldn't be selling to.
PPI.
And we've seen it time and time again. Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole litany of things, and obviously car finance is just the latest in the list of scandals. All those things, though, they're all designed at a management level, and they are shipped out and sold by the branch staff. At Barclays, we got to go and spend days working in branches. If you spoke to the people in the branches, they were there because it was a job, and they were there because that was the job that was available, and the other job was working in Sainsbury's, as an example. And there wasn't really any difference in them. They didn't think that they were a financial services provider in that way. It was just a job that they did. So they did what they were told to do. They weren't bad people. They'd always try and do the right thing, but they'd do the right thing in the context of what they were told to do by their managers. And indeed, their managers at the branch level were pretty much doing what they were told to do by their managers. And so it cascaded upwards. And we've seen that go horribly wrong. So Wells Fargo is a good example where we know that went horribly wrong. We've all read the reports. People were basically being told, if you don't do stuff that we're asking you to do, you run the risk of being fired. So that fear was what was driving the bad behaviour. But it wasn't bad people at the branch level. I think the difference at the wholesale level is actually there's a much more opportunity for individuals to individually do something wrong. And that's again, is what we've tended to see, obviously the most extreme examples being rogue traders. I think that's why the conduct conversation within a wholesaling organisation has to be much more attuned to the individual rather than to the organisation. So there's all this discussion about the bad apple or the bad barrel. I don't think either of those is actually strictly true. I think the issue that we have in a wholesale environment is we create an environment, which is the barrel, which is not a perfect environment. People behave in an office in banking in a way that I don't think they'd behave at home. The sort of language that you hear people using, just as an example, is not the sort of language I imagine they use when they go home and are with their wives, husbands, children. So the environment you're in is already slightly warped. And then I think the other problem that we have is there is then the opportunity and an incentive to do stuff that makes money. And suddenly it can quite easily become a perverse incentive to do the wrong thing. And I think that's just a danger that people need to be aware of. I think most people who work in banking are good people. They just have these perverse incentives to do stuff in a certain way. And I think they get blinded by the environment and they end up doing stuff that actually, if they were able to take a step back, they probably wouldn't do. The problem is in the spur of the moment, when they're in that environment, there's a real danger that they don't realise that what they're doing isn't the right thing.
Yeah, and I've seen many examples where people were very different in and out of work. That's the first thing. The second thing is that when you look into the extreme cases of rogue trading, where things went horribly wrong, and for a long time, usually it started with an error that people tried to correct, and then the correction did not work and amplified the initial problem, and then it spiraled out of control. A lot of the losses in the industry stemmed actually from that. It's not necessarily fraud as much as an initial thing that was supposed to go right that didn't go right, and then the person did the wrong thing at the wrong time.
The other one that's quite interesting with rogue trading is there's quite a lot of evidence that a lot of rogue trading started off with someone trying to help someone else. So they were actually trying to help a colleague sort out an error, and that was what was the actual initial instigator. I think the other one that's really cool is that this whole point around, do we behave in work the same way as we do at home? One of the things I used to say when I was doing the conduct training at Deutsche Bank was encouraging people to bring in photos of their families and keep them on their desks. So for that reason alone, I'm very anti-hot desking, because I think it's really, really useful to have some reminders of your family and your home environment in the office, because that hopefully helps to normalise your behaviour slightly. When the first COVID lockdown happened, there was an awful lot of discussion in all of the risk and control committees about the risk of traders working from home and doing bad things. And I was a lone voice shouting out saying, no, this isn't true. Every piece of behavioural psychology that I've read would suggest that people should actually be better at home than they are in the office. And the head of markets at the time actually chipped in at that point in the BRCC meeting and said, that's interesting you say that, because actually we think we're missing business at the moment because our traders are noticeably more risk off in their home environment than they are in the office. So a non-scientific, but anecdotally, very interesting observation.
I'll be curious to see from people listening to that podcast whether they've observed the same, but it's that environment effectively creates an anchor, right? A behavioral anchor. That's probably the way I will frame it. I've never thought about it, so I find that concept, bring it back to basic values and make sure that if people misbehave, they misbehave in front of their kids and wife or spouse or dog, who knows, might create that positive incentive not to do something bad.
Yeah, you're now reminding me of something that happened when I was a trainee solicitor. There was a partner at my firm who had her office decorated as though it was a sitting room, which was a source of much amusement to everybody else in the office. So she had like chintz curtains and a sofa in her office. And I'm actually wondering now whether that was maybe a deliberate ploy to change people's behaviour. I have no idea.
Yeah, potentially. And I'd like to connect our discussion back a little bit to regulations that you mentioned as well. With regulation evolving very quickly, clearly in the UK connected to conduct and risk culture, we've seen SMCR that had various degree of success. How do you ensure that the organization you work with remain proactive in that space and understand the risk coming with conduct, culture, compliance?
I think there's two different questions embedded in your question. So one is, how do large organisations stay on top of the changing regulation, particularly when they're large global firms? So, where I most recently worked at Citi, we were in 92 countries, I believe. The amount of regulatory change that was hitting us daily was enormous. And there was, in fact, a specific team within the second line who did nothing but monitor regulatory change and alert people to changes. I think for that part of the equation, there will be a solution in the long term, which will be AI-driven, in my opinion. It's the obvious use of AI in the risk and control space is that ability to ingest new regulation as and when it lands, and then to interpret that and to immediately say, your policy in this country now needs to change because I've also ingested all of your policies, and therefore I now know clause 4.2.1 of this policy needs to change. So that hopefully will come. I know lots of people are looking at it. But
here is a business model for whoever is interested.
Yeah, well, I think there's plenty of people already looking at it. I think the challenge with that always will be, how much can you trust the machine? Now, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to trust the machine long term, but obviously no regulator is going to have any sympathy for the bank that gets it wrong because their machine told them to do it differently. So that's the challenge always. The very interesting one around risk culture and conduct is really that point around people genuinely caring about it and knowing what they are actually doing in terms of fixing stuff. So what I've seen where risk is being really poorly managed in organisations is people are chasing issues rather than root causes. It's a very audit-driven approach, by the way. So lots of people who work in risk and control have an audit background, and in my opinion, that's not a good thing at all because they tend to be issue chasers. If you fix the issue and don't look at the wider risk scenario and the underlying root causes, what you'll find is you'll have another issue and another issue and another issue. And certainly if you're in a large global organisation as well, you'll have the same issue arising in multiple jurisdictions. So I think you need to be able to take that step back and go, okay, I have this high-risk audit issue that's been found in whatever location it is, but what's actually causing that issue? Because if I look at the number of times people have fixed take a payments process as a good example, in a country, and then there's been a similar incident in another country, which is also a high-risk issue and it's also payments related, all it needed was someone to take a step back and go, actually, let's look at our payments processes globally, work out why these issues keep happening, and fix them at the root cause level, rather than saying, we made this mistaken payment in X country, let's create a manual control or a four eyes check or some other stupidity to make sure that this thing doesn't happen again in this country, which then falls flat on its face in another country, or indeed falls flat on its face in that country because it's a manual, useless check of four eyes. And what you tend to find is with four eyes checks is that the checker thinks that the other person's already done it. My worst example of that was at a nameless bank I worked at where they'd introduced a six eyes check because the four eyes wasn't working very well. And that went wrong. And when they asked the people, why did that go wrong? The third person in that chain said, well, of course, the other guy had already done the check. The four eyes checker, the second person said, oh, well, I knew there was the guy who was going to look at it after me, so I didn't really look at it. And the first guy who'd input the stuff wrong in the first place said, well, I knew there were two other guys who were going to check my figures, so that's why I thought it was all right. So you can very quickly create worse and worse problems from yourself the more of these things that you do.
Well, I think I know which organization you're talking about, and it almost sunk it, actually, because the payment that went out that day was, I think, 10 billion, which no bank can really sustain in one go. So they had a big problem. And I think, as I was listening to you, for me, there are two things that popped to mind. One is, and I had example of that, of the audit function challenging me when I was in risk, because I actually incentivize people not necessarily to fix the controls necessarily, but also to look back into the underlying risk exposures and ask themselves, instead of finding controls over controls over controls, which, by the way, all of those things fail because we don't have the resources to add, to your example, 4i checks. And yes, it's documented somewhere in the procedures, but no one is following them, or follow them perhaps for a month and then it falls by the wayside. Go back to understand why that risk is there, whether we should have it, and address the underlying root cause. But the audit function didn't understand that. And I was literally challenged as to, why would you do that? Well, it's actually cheaper and more effective and efficient for the organization to do it this way, rather than piling controls. The other example for me is around addressing the symptoms rather than, to your point, the root cause. That leads invariably to more complexity.
Completely agree with you. And I think the other issue that we have is people don't identify key controls. So there's this weird notion that more controls equals better. We've seen risk and control inventories just exponentially increase over the last 10 years. And it's completely the wrong approach. So the way to do it properly is to understand your process end to end properly, identify the points in that process where there are key activities that are a make or break activity, and that's where you want your key controls to be. If you fully understand your process end to end, and you fully understand those key moments in that process where you're able to stop a mistake from happening, and then put in controls that actually work, and get rid of all of the noise that's the non-control control inventory, then you have a chance of actually making stuff better and working properly. I think the problem these days is we do get driven by audit and now indeed by second-line assurance functions to create solutions for issues, not create solutions for those key moments in end-to-end processes.
It's, again, focalizing on the symptom rather than the actual root cause. This also comes back to the point you were raising before on roles and responsibilities across the business, the risk compliance function, and audit as well. I deliberately do not use the term 3 lines, but it comes back to that, right? And that point around duplication, especially between second and third line, I've seen it everywhere I worked for.
No other industry other than the financial services industry has a 3 lines model. Every other business in the world has a bunch of people who do the business and some people in audit who do an independent audit of that activity. Quite why the financial services industry thinks that the model they've chosen is the right one still escapes me. I totally get that you need to have a robust function who are challenging the business to make sure they're doing the right thing, particularly in a regulated environment. But why those people have to be in a completely separate line of defence is a mystery to me. They can still have an independent reporting line, so I totally get you don't want to tie their bonuses to the business in the way that the first line is tied to the business, but you can do that by just having a different reporting line. You don't need to create this whole second line structure around it. It's just, to my mind, an expensive way of dealing with the problem.
It's an easy way, I think, in people's mind to deal with the problem. But I've also seen situations, not in finance actually, but in the non-profit space where that divide created problems between boards of very large non-profit. I think the one I had in mind operated in 140 countries, so by no means a small one. It was very large. And the Audit and Risk Committee that had taken that view of independence to the point that they became completely confrontation with the board. And people have a tendency to forget they're part of the same organization, pursuing normally the same business objective or organizational objectives.
Well, it's also getting back to the culture point as well, though. So if you set up an antagonistic culture within your organization where there are three lines of defense who are all attacking each other, you're automatically going to be denigrating the ability to control your business properly. So there's nothing wrong with the three lines model. I think the problem we have with the three lines model per se is that it's become too extreme. So the segregation between the lines has become sort of a militant philosophy.
In its own right,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly, which I can't think is right.
I have on my LinkedIn profile some very hard defensors against the three line of defense model. In fact, one of them posted on my LinkedIn profile this morning, I think. And so I think it's a good segue as well around the challenges organizations might face with their compliance risk and oversight function in general. Do you see anything else you could add to that, and perhaps some piece of wisdom you could share with us?
Yeah, so I'd really just basically encourage the compliance advisory teams to co-own the risk with the first line. I understand why there was this move to try and make the first line more aware of the fact that they were responsible for risk, because there certainly was a time in my career where risk was something that was done for the first line by the second line. So the second line managed the risk on behalf of the first line. And I did see that very early on in my career. I think that's changed completely, but I think it's now gone to the other extreme. What we now have is this very extreme version of the truth where it's entirely the first line's problem. And that can't be right either. I just think we all need to take a deep breath and sort of calm down a bit and start trying to be a bit more collegiate and work together to try and help the organisations that we work for find better solutions to some of the problems.
And again, we're all there to meet the same overarching business objectives, right, at the end of the day. One of the things you have, and here I'm going to step aside a little bit from pure compliance to move into financial crime, because that's one of the things you had the pleasure to work on as well. And that risk is everywhere, right? And it's always here, regardless of what the organization do. In fact, whether it's banking or not doesn't matter, because that impacts all organizations across the world. So what trends and emerging threats do you see in that space that organizations should really pay attention to?
First of all, the challenge with financial crime is the way that we talk about it, it tends to be talked about in an abstract way and or a frameworky way where people are discussing KYC requirements or whatever. What we aren't doing well enough is having a conversation within the industry about what financial crime actually means. And what it actually means is terrorists getting guns and bombs. It means humans being trafficked in horrible places and ways around the world. It means illegal drugs being sold around the place. So financial crime is very tangible and real. I think where we currently are seeing a lot more work going on is third-party payment processors means that the way that money moves around the world these days is very, very different to how it used to be and much, much harder to track. The good news is I think there's a lot of good work going on in the AI space now where we are seeing AI being used very effectively to look at networks and look at the way money flows are happening around the world, which means that you can pick up suspicious activity much more readily. I think that that's a huge challenge for us, though, still as an industry, and it's one that we clearly aren't on top of because you look at the figures that get released every year about the cost of financial crime globally. Clearly, there's an awful lot of financial crime going on all the time. So all we can do is keep fighting that fight. I think the other aligned big issue that I see at the moment is obviously the advance of quantum computing. I think it's being very overlooked by the industry. In fact, there was an article today on the BBC about Google's new chip that they've invented, which can break a code. I think they said it was in 5 minutes. The most powerful normal computer would take the eternity of mankind thus far. An unbreakable code is now 5 minutes breaking time. Why are we not more worried about this? So I keep meeting COOs and talking at COO meet and greets about this risk. It's not on anybody's emerging risk radar. And generally the response has been, well, quantum computers are few and far between and this isn't a real risk. And my response to that is, no, they're not. Quantum computers are becoming more and more commonplace. Yes, they're still extremely difficult to operate because you have to use these extreme low temperatures, but there are plenty of bad actors in the world who certainly have the resources to have quantum computing. If anybody realistically thinks that Russia doesn't have quantum computers somewhere, they are going to be very mistaken, I would imagine. And why would they not want to allow bad actors access to those to hurt the Western banking world? Because the Western banking world has already hurt Russia's central bank very badly by excluding it from SWIFT. The Russian state has no incentive to try and help the Western banks in this world.
And it's an interesting one because when you look into data encryption, for example, yes, for a large number of them nowadays, there might not be the capabilities to actually break the code. But actually, what those actors are doing now is putting them aside, waiting for the computing aspect, including quantum computing, to catch up, and then they're going to actually crack the codes. The world is moving, and the perspective on this risk has to evolve as well. It's not a here and now we have a problem. It's, well, we might have a problem now, but the impact might be felt several years down the line.
There was a very good documentary I watched on the BBC, actually, which was talking about fraud, and they went to, I think it was Visa's cybersecurity centre in the UK, which is in some secret location. They couldn't show you going into it. There were two really interesting things I thought from that one. One was the way that you can now buy bad coders online is absurdly easy. There's like they showed you there's like an online marketplace that even ranks them. They get 1 to 5 stars, so it's like literally like Amazon.
It sounds like Fiverr to me. I don't know if you know that website. But
I don't, but they showed it was absolutely fascinating. So first of all, you get all of these bad actors who are coding stuff that is basically coding phishing attacks and the like. The other thing that was also quite interesting was the head of security at this centre was pointing out that as well as ranking your coders, the payments on the dark web now require 3-factor authentication. And you kind of go, well, hang on a minute, we've only just moved on to 2-factor authentication in terms of mainstream banking in the UK. But the criminals have already worked out that that's going to be so vulnerable, especially when quantum computing comes live, that they've already moved themselves onto 3-factor authentication. You kind of go, well, why are we all sitting here happily using 2-factor authentication when the people we're trying to protect ourselves from are already using 3-factor? I find it very, very scary.
Well, I also find it a very good lesson learned, to be honest. But on that note, I'd like to bring us to a close and ask slightly lighter questions to you. And I'll start with a very easy one. What's common misconception about risk leadership you'd like to challenge? And what advice would you give to aspiring leaders?
The interesting one there, I think, is why would we talk about risk leadership? We're just talking about leadership. So I'll answer the question from my own perspective, which is good leaders are people who care about the people that they're leading and who are authentic. And that's not actually as common as you think it would be. I've had so much feedback in my career from people who work for me about the fact that they're having real, honest conversations with me that they've not had with other people. I've had some very difficult conversations with some people in my career as well. So I had one where I was telling somebody that they really need to go and find themselves a different job because they weren't suited to what they were doing. And at the end of that person said to me, "Thank you so much. I've been here for 16 years now, and that's the first honest conversation I've ever had with one of my bosses." And I find that so horrific. So I absolutely always wear my heart on my sleeve. I always have done. And I'm really proud of the fact that I wear my heart on my sleeve. I bring my whole self to work. What you see at work, Toby, is the same as what you see at home, Toby. And I think that's something that is sadly often missing in leadership.
And if you could give a TED talk on anything other than your expertise, what would it be?
Well, I have a very weird theory about the universe and black holes, and I'd like to have the time to explore that further and then do a TED talk on that.
Feature Stephen Hawking, right?
No, not that clever.
And so what's the most rewarding part of your job?
Without any shadow of a doubt, leading people. Watching the people that you lead succeed is just the most brilliant thing. Helping people to become the directors, managing directors they've always dreamed of being is absolutely the most rewarding part of this job.
And perhaps connected to that, actually, what recent book, podcast, or article has had a big impact on your thinking?
Yeah, okay, I'm not going to pick one that's had the biggest impact. What I'm going to say is I'm currently reading a book called The Housefly Effect, which is a brilliant book about behavioural science. All of the books I've read on behavioural science have had the biggest impact on my career. I'm a massive, massive advocate of behavioural psychology as a driver for behaviour and as a driver for good leadership, and understanding the tics that make people do stuff is really, really important for making sure that works. And The Housefly Effect is a really great book. And I'm loving the fact that there's a brilliant pun in Victorian bathroom wear. So The Housefly Effect is all about putting a little fly on the urinals in Schiphol Airport. And it makes people aim more accurately. Well, men aim more accurately. And it's reduced their cleaning costs by about 30%, apparently, which is amazing. But the Victorians thought of this long before they did, and they used to have a bee as their aiming thing. And the best thing of all is, obviously, the Latin for bee is apis, and the Victorians were certainly clever enough to understand that apis was exactly what they were doing.
I love that example. And finally, where can people go and learn more about you?
Oh, if you Google me, you'll find out all kinds of weird stuff about the fact that I used to work in the film industry many, many, many years ago. Probably comes up less these days than it used to because I've talked at a lot of conferences over the last 10 years. So feel free to Google me. I'm not very interesting. That's a side of my career that happened a long time ago that was a lot less interesting than it sounds.
Multi-talented, I can see. So, well, Toby, thank you so much for sharing with us all this wisdom today. I think that's a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Julien.
Thank you for tuning in into this episode of RiskMasters. I hope you found today's conversation with Toby Billington insightful and thought-provoking. From simplifying compliance frameworks to leveraging behavioral science and preparing for emerging threats like AI-driven fraud and quantum computing, Toby has shared valuable strategies and insights for building resilient organizations. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, follow, and leave a review on your player of choice. Your feedback helps us continue delivering top insights from industry leaders and be visible. Don't forget to visit avtm.com, my website, for show notes, additional resources, and related articles. Stay connected and join us next time for more conversations about risk management, foresight, and disruptive impact with Roger Spitz. And remember, keep pushing boundaries, keep making an impact, and continue shaping the future of risk management. Until the next time, I'm Julien Haye, and this has been RiskMasters.
Thank you for joining us on RiskMasters today. If you're ready to master risk and unleash your full potential, here's how you can take the next steps. First, head over to julienhaye.com to discover even more valuable insights from our RiskMasters. We've got a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you. Second, don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform. Stay tuned for fascinating discussions on risk management. And third, if you found today's episode valuable, please share it on social media. Help others discover the world of RiskMasters and embark on their journey of risk mastery. Remember, success favors the bold. See you on the next episode of RiskMasters.